All right. So we looked at this argument that was first hit upon during what we think of as the Middle Ages by theologians who were trying to understand the nature of God. Now, the most popular version of this in the contemporary media is the version that Homer uses against Flanders in The Simpsons. Homer knocks on the door. Uh, Flanders opens the door. Homer's got a set of note cards. Right? Homer then uh, starts reading his note cards, and he says, Flanders, answer me this. Can your God heat a burrito that's so hot that your God can't eat it? Now, this is just another version of this difficulty, this incoherence of omnipotence. The idea is that if you're omnipotent, there's anything you can do. But if you can do anything, then you can do things that would make it impossible for you to do other things. And hence it looks like the notion of unrestrained omnipotence is incoherent. It's not internally consistent. So when Spinoza gave this, he was excommunicated from the church. He was a practitioner of the Jewish faith, and so he was excommunicated from the Jewish church. And people were very upset at Spinoza. And so I've got a little bit of the text of his excommunication to illustrate this. All right? So, by decree of the angels and command of the holy men, we excommunicate, expel, curse, and damn Baruch de Spinoza, cursing him with the excommunication with which Joshua banned Jericho, and with the curse which Eliza cursed the boys, and with all the castigations which are written in the book of the law. Cursed be he by day, and cursed be he by night. Cursed be he when he lies down, and cursed be he when he rises up. Cursed be he when he goes out, and cursed be he when he goes in. So, as you can see, Spinoza was excommunicated, and people were extremely upset with him. And in fact, because he was excommunicated, under law at that time, he didn't exist legally. And so his family then came in, they took all this stuff. And so he had to go to court to prove his own existence, to reclaim his stuff. Now, Spinoza made his money as a lens grinder, which at that time was a really lucrative gig. It was a highly skilled and sought-after ability. And so as a result, he was quite wealthy. And so after he won his case, he then gave his belongings back to his family and went on to make money. So, he was a pretty righteous dude overall. So we're thinking about divine command theory, and we're saying to ourselves, look, if divine command theory were true, then it really seems to have some unfortunate implications. It doesn't seem like a good theory about the source of moral authority. So maybe instead we should opt for this view that God is a moral reporter as opposed to a moral commander. That God commands us to do things because God sees that those are the right things to do, not because God wills them, but because that's the way things are. And so the source of normative authority for moral commands is the nature of the world and not God's will. You might think, well, that sounds terrible. But when faced with this difficulty with the nature of omnipotence, what did philosophers of religion and theologians do? Well, they went back and they said, look, this looks like a good argument. We accept the premises. It's a deductively valid argument. What are we going to do? Well, let's change the way that we think about omnipotence. And so they constrained omnipotence in a way that would not result in omnipotence allowing for contradictory abilities. In other words, being able to do things that would then make it impossible for you to do other things. And so they said, look, God is omnipotent, but by omnipotent, we mean God can do anything that is logically possible. Now, this isn't omnipotence pure and simple. It's a sort of strangely constrained omnipotence. But this was the solution that most philosophers of religion and theologians adopted in the face of this ideological difficulty that emerged in their thinking about the nature of God. And so we might well adopt this moral reporter view of God and get rid of this divine command theory view of God for the same reason, that it just looks more palatable intellectually, that it seems to lead to fewer problems, that the notion of divine command theory is intrinsically problematic, and so it isn't a viable theory about the source of moral authority. And you might say, well, that's fine, but why would that matter? Well, intellectually, it suggests that you can be moral even if you don't know about or believe in any particular deity. Right? More generally, right? No matter what God you believe in or whether you believe in God at all, it seems like you can attempt to get at the moral properties of the world. You can look for objectively correct moral norms and guide your actions by those moral norms. It's not something that's intrinsically linked to religion. And this is something that Rachel wants to talk about. Rachel's, in his chapter, says that one of the things that divine command theory shows is that religion and morality are just two different things. They're not necessarily in conflict with each other and so on. They're just different things. And so we should restrict our moral thinking to moral theorizing. We restrict our religious thinking to religious theorizing. That's the way that he sort of deals with this. Now, not everybody has held this view. Right? Some people, even people who are venerated for their toleration, have held that you can't expect people who don't believe in, say, the Judeo-Christian God, in the case of this guy here, to be moral. And in fact, this guy who wrote, quote unquote, a letter concerning toleration, sort of famously wrote this letter concerning toleration, in which he argued that we should be tolerant of different religious views. Everyone should, be true to their conscience, and we should understand that people acting in good faith who are true to their conscience shouldn't be criticized for that. We should be tolerant of their beliefs even when they differ from our own. Right? But the end of the letter of tolerance, he says this: lastly, those are not at all to be tolerated who deny the being of God. Promises, covenants, and oaths, which are the bonds of human society, can have no hold upon an atheist. Well, this would be problematic for this moral reporter's view. If we think that, look, it doesn't depend on your believing in one particular deity or another. You're consulting one particular religious text or another. You just have to earnestly try to discover correct moral judgments and adhere to the normative conventions that you discover to be reasonable, that respect other people's interests, and so on. If you believe that, then atheists can do that, as well as Buddhists, as well as Islamists, as well as Christians, as well as Jews. Right? So this particular linkage between religion and morality is very common, was very common. Right? But it doesn't look like it's rationally motivated, and this is Rachel's point. So what are we to get from this first lecture on divine command theory? Well, this lecture is all about what's the source of the authority of our ethical norms. And the core ideas here are that there are two kinds of questions about ethical norms. On the one hand, there are questions about ontology and metaphysics. So, are there correct moral norms? Where do those norms get their authority? Why do they guide our actions? Should they guide our actions? Those sorts of questions. And there's another set of questions about how we can come about knowing. What sources can we consult? What methodology should we employ if we want to come to know what the correct moral norms are and how we should use those norms to guide our lives? We looked at divine command theory as an attempt to answer the first set of questions about moral authority. And what we discovered, right, was that divine command theory, in linking what's good or the source of authority for moral norms to the will of a deity, right, seemed to create more problems than it solved with regard to those questions about the authority of norms. And we saw that by looking at this dilemma that Plato brings out for divine command theorists. And we discovered that there are really two choices that the divine command theorists can make with regard to God's relationship, any God's relationship, to moral prescriptions, and that neither of them are desirable from the divine command theory.